So the Nintendo Switch 2 is just over 2 weeks old, and it released with what in my opinion was a pretty weak lineup of day one launch titles. Sure, we had the likes of Mario Kart World, Split Fiction and the awesome Fast Fusion, but the rest mainly comprised of either ports of existing games or upgraded version of Switch 1 titles. And I'm not knocking the quality of the lineup, I think there were some fantastic games to choose from, but there was one title which stood out amongst the rest as being the worst Nintendo Switch 2 launch title, and you all know the one I'm talking about. And so today I thought it'd be fun to take a look back at the worst day one launch titles for each of Nintendo's mainline consoles, and let you the viewers judge for yourselves what the worst day one launch title in Nintendo console history is. So like I said, the Switch launched with some solid titles, but the Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour was by far the worst launch title for the console. Setting aside the fact that Nintendo decided to charge $10 for what should have been a freebie, the game itself just wasn't really a game at all. It was essentially a glorified instruction manual, requiring you to travel between different Nintendo Switch 2 components such as the Joy-Cons, screen and other accessories, hunting down invisible stamp pedestals, and being lectured in great depth about the intricacies of the construction. And at the end of it all, you got to treat yourself to a fun little quiz which felt like an end of year exam. There was also the opportunity to partake in some lacklustre minigames which would have felt right at home in any 1001 bargain bin game bundle from the 90s. Though admittedly, there were a couple of decent ones thrown into the mix, like playing through World 1-1 of Super Mario Bros at a 1:1 pixel scale on a 4K TV. But for the most part, they were a pretty dull affair. Unfortunately, you couldn't just explore all of this content either, as in order to access the new games and new areas, you first needed to have earned a specific number of medals, which ultimately required you to replay previous minigames until you beat the high scores. But to top all of this off, if you didn't own the appropriate hardware, such as a 4K TV, a Pro Controller 2, and a USB camera, you couldn't actually complete the game as these were necessary to partake in some of the minigames. All in all, a very underwhelming launch title, and one that Nintendo could definitely stand to learn from. The Nintendo Switch 1 had a somewhat limited launch lineup, however standout titles such as Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey offered plenty for gamers to sink their teeth into whilst the selection ramped up. There was my favourite roguelike of all time to drop on day one with The Binding of Isaac, the somewhat mediocre Super Bomberman R, and the party game 1-2 Switch, and then there was Vroom in the Night Sky. Now this little gem of a game is kind of what would happen if Superman 64 and Harry Potter on the PS1 had a baby, with Hagrid being the daddy of course. But it is oft voted as being the worst title on the Nintendo Switch, with gameplay which involved flying around lifeless levels atop bicycles, brooms and magical benches, collecting stardust and shooting missiles at giant flowing rings, and it somehow managed to be even less exciting than the aforementioned Superman 64. While admittedly, the control scheme was nowhere near as bad as that game, that's not to say it wasn't bad, it was awful, with slippery turning and baffling manoeuvres which you never actually find a use for. But in all honesty, nowadays I do feel like the game gets a lot more of a slating than it truly deserves, considering some of the horrendous games that have since been released on the platform. Sure, it was a tedious, unfun mess, but there was still at least one redeeming feature in the form of the memories, requiring you to complete levels in under a certain time limit, and these actually added some much needed challenge to the game. But all in all, it has definitely earned its place as the worst release title on the Nintendo Switch. Following the success of the Nintendo Wii, Nintendo decided to do a Nintendo and get all creative on us with the hardware, and thus the Wii U was born, a sort of bastard child of the Wii and what would eventually be the Nintendo Switch, but the launch lineup for the platform was pretty extensive and by all accounts quite stellar. We had the likes of New Super Mario Bros. U, Assassin's Creed 3 and Call of Duty Black Ops 2. And then we had this generation's answer to Wii Sports with Game Party Champions, the 5th entry in the Game Party series. Much like Wii Sports, this one was a party game featuring a selection of minigames including ping pong, mini golf, air hockey, football and basketball. However, unlike Nintendo's contribution, the games in Game Party Champions were barely functional, with criticism directed towards their unresponsive controls, consistent performance issues and long load times, which in some instances took upwards of a minute to load into a single game. There was also the depressing story mode to enjoy, which revolved around some kid competing in arcade tournaments to get over his dead father, and party mode, where 4 players get to compete against one another, though the competition was limited to one person actually playing the minigame, whilst the other 3 grief them, which basically translates to 3 people trying to stop one person from having fun. A party game to end all party games, this one, or at least destroy your appetite for them in any case. Much like the Wii U, the Nintendo Wii had a fairly extensive lineup of launch titles, and unlike the Switch 2, we actually got an awesome packing title in the form of Wii Sports. But in addition to this, there was The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, Super Monkey Ball Blitz and Trauma Center Second Opinion, all of which utilised the console's motion controls to great effect. Admittedly, some of the console's ports did struggle a little due to the hardware, including the likes of Call of Duty 3 and Need for Speed Carbon, but it was another racing game which took pole position as the worst launch title on the Wii with Ubisoft's GT Pro series. Positioning itself as a kind of Gran Turismo Wii edition, GT Pro series aimed to bring realistic racing mechanics to the platform, as players utilised the motion controls, physically holding their arms out in a stress position to turn the controllers, as though they were turning a real-life steering wheel. However, the lack of analog controls diminished this somewhat, with the brake and throttle instead assigned to the 1 and 2 buttons. Notwithstanding its torturous control scheme though, the graphics and audio of GT Pro series were a real eye and ear sore, with mismatched art styles, low poly vehicles and flat clip art style environments to race through, and a soundtrack which Eurogamer described as happy hardcore music played on a Casio organ. But the gameplay didn't fare much better either, as despite its lineup of licensed vehicles, the racing itself felt weightless and slippery, with very little difference in handling between the cars, and an uninspiring unlock system rather than the cash-based progression of Gran Turismo. A real car crash of a game, this one, coming in last place in the Nintendo Wii launch title race. Despite its tumultuous launch and subsequent failure to please as Nintendo scrambled to make sales, dropping the price of the console to under $100 less than 2 years after launch, the Nintendo GameCube would go on to spawn iconic game franchises such as Pikmin and Luigi's Mansion, the latter of which released as a launch title for the platform. Amongst a somewhat meagre, yet overall pretty decent selection of day one releases, none of which were particularly bad, it would have to be the big dogs themselves, Disney, who would release the worst day one launch title on the platform. Now, there was nothing inherently bad about Disney's Tarzan Untamed, and it was praised for having some solid platforming, decent visuals and fun gameplay mechanics. However, it has to be said, it was always going to be held back somewhat by its target audience and a ridiculously short playtime, clocking in at around the 2.5 hour mark according to How Long to Beat. Sure, there is definitely some replayability when it comes to collecting all of the film reels for some extra goodies, but being a Disney game, it kind of appealed to a specific type of audience, primarily that being of children under the age of 10 and Disney adults. Ugh. Like I said, this one does get some decent ratings and there's a lot to like about the game, but compared to the other day one launch titles on the GameCube, it just didn't really stand a chance. Now if we're talking about limited launch titles, then the N64 is definitely king, as this bad boy released with a grand total of 3. That's right, 3 day 1 release titles, one of which was only released in Japan. The console would go on to add 2 more to the lineup for its European release 6 months later, but in America you had the choice between Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64. Now both of these titles were incredibly good, each game for a different audience and each were a fantastic showcase of the console's capabilities, but considering the genre-defining impact that Mario 64 has had on platformer games with its innovative controls and gameplay mechanics, unfortunately I'd have to say that Pilot Wings 64 was the worst day 1 N64 launch title. Comparing the two would be like comparing apples and pears of course, but while Mario 64 was a revolutionary 3D platformer, Pilot Wings 64 was a pioneering flight simulator, blending arcade and flying simulation elements into a delightfully enjoyable gameplay experience. With its 4 unique islands, each with their own distinct challenges and environments, players got to pick from 6 different pilots and explore the islands, unlocking medals using one of 3 modes of transport, including the hang glider, rocket belt and gyrocopter, and there were also a few different minigames on offer. But all in all, it was a great little launch title and a worthy successor to the SNES original. Alongside the N64, the SNES had a limited but not quite minute lineup of launch titles, and again they were also all pretty solid. The original Pilot Wings released alongside Super Mario World, which was bundled as a packing title in the US, but the other 3 games were Gradius 2, Sim City and F-Zero, totaling 5 day 1 launch titles. Another tough decision to be made with this one, considering they're all so different, but again, unfortunately, this one is probably going to have to go to Pilot Wings. However, it could be considered a 3-way tie due to a few of the games having notable flaws. SimCity had a somewhat niche audience due to its genre, and its interface was criticised for being a little slow and clunky, but it did have some fantastic replayability and complexity to it. Gradius 3 was a modified version of the original arcade release, changing up the level order and making it more accessible by reducing the difficulty and allowing players to continue after they lost all of their lives, though this one was also criticised for its performance on the platform. Pilot Wings on the other hand was praised heavily for its use of the SNES Mode 7 features, but has since drawn criticism for its simplistic gameplay in comparison to the other titles. But it was still a fantastic game for the time though, and like its successor, tasked players with earning licenses as they piloted various vehicles and collected medals in order to progress. F-Zero was mainly criticised for its lack of multiplayer and difficulty curve, and Super Mario Bros, well, that game's near perfect. But like I said, all of these titles were great in their own right, and I'm reluctant to point the finger at any of them as being the worst launch title on the SNES, so let me know your opinion on this one. With the launch of the NES, or Famicom as it was known in Japan, Nintendo was almost single-handedly responsible for wresting the video game industry out of collapse, and a diverse library of 17 titles launched with the console in 1983. 2 years later it would make its way to America, where its lineup would include the likes of Super Mario Bros and Duck Hunt, which were later bundled together with the Light Gun as part of the Action Set System bundle. There was the awesome Excitebike, which alongside Mario Bros was arguably the console's best release title, and several sports titles simply titled Tennis, Baseball and Golf. Once again though, it's quite difficult to determine the worst launch title here, given that Nintendo were trying to establish the concept of quality over quantity, but 3 games in particular stand out, those being 10 Yard Fight, Clu Clu Land and Hogan's Alley. Clu Clu Land was a unique puzzle game in which players had to direct a character called Bubbles through a series of pegboards, collecting items and avoiding enemies, and the game was criticised for its unconventional control scheme and lack of gameplay variety. Hogan's Alley was one of 3 light gun games which launched with the console, the other 2 being Duck Hunt and Wild Gunman, and it was an arcade game port which was criticised for its simplistic graphics and lack of depth when compared with the other light gun games. But its 10-Yard Fight, the NES first American football game which earns its crown as the worst NES release title due to its uninspired graphics, poor sound design and repetitive gameplay, with no game modes to select from, and the only objective being to score a touchdown before the timer runs out, with limited offensive and defensive options on offer. The NES launch titles may all have been good enough to revive the gaming industry, but at least one of them failed to score points with gamers, and that game was 10-Yard Fight. So there you have it, those were the worst day one launch titles for all mainstream Nintendo consoles, and a quick shout out to the Virtual Boy and Colour TV game. I'm sorry you guys weren't included, but neither of you were truly consoles in my opinion, and it's quite difficult to criticise a few lines on a screen. But hey ho, anyway, let me know if you agree with this list and which if any of the included titles should be crowned worst of the worst, or if you disagree with any of the choices, feel free to let me know that I'm wrong, and let me know in the comments what you deem to be the worst and why. As always though, thanks for watching, subscribe for more Nintendo Switch reviews and content, and until next time, take care of yourselves and game on.